We'd like to start right on time. So thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center. I'm Bill Hoagland here with the center. We are particularly honored to have not only the current FDA commissioner with us this afternoon, but also three former FDA commissioners who have worked with us on this project as we delve into how to use evidence to help find new and advance new therapies and treatments for diseases that many of us thought were incurable just a few years ago. As a sidebar, I recently read Francis Collins' book, The Language of Life. I admit to the doctors I didn't understand it all, but he did observe that medical science is not linear, and mapping of our DNA is the language of life. To me, the work of the FDA is in understanding that language in order to protect and preserve life. We have a project here at BPC we call the Future of Healthcare. It's under the leadership of my old boss on Capitol Hill, which was Senator Dr. Bill Frist and Senator Tom Daschle. I personally think that the future of healthcare lies significantly in the work of the FDA and its dedicated public servants. Many who, by the way, I might note, worked through the recent shutdown, holding fast to the agency's mission of protecting the health and safety of the American public. And if you didn't notice it, even in the midst of this recent shutdown, FDA researchers were able to identify the sources of the cancer-causing impurities that have tainted millions of bottles of commonly used generic blood pressure and heart failure medicine. I think the country owes a deep debt of gratitude for Commissioner Gottlieb, for his leadership at FDA over the last 35 days, and quite frankly over his nearly 2 years tenure there, as well as his predecessors who are here with us today. Now, about today's brief forum. This is our second phase of work on real-world evidence under the guidance of Janet Marcher-Broda, who has led our health innovation portfolio here at BPC for the last 8 years. Our first report was issued in the summer of 2016, and we are proud to say that the Bipartisan 21st Century Cures Act signed into law in December of 2016 included many of BPC's 19 recommendations that were developed in that report. BPC is also pleased with the tremendous program and progress that Dr. Gottlieb and his agency have made in implementing that act, as well as the attention, Dr. Gottlieb, you've given to regressive cell therapies. Again, we are also very honored to have the leadership of three former FDA commissioners on this project with us today, who have all unselfishly contributed to our work, all distinguished doctors in their own right: Rob Califf, Mark McClellan, and Andy von Eschenbach. We want to thank Greg Daniels, Morgan Romine of Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy, who have been assisting in this work. And finally, my special thanks to Jane Kozinski and Ted Giovannis Foundation for supporting both the phases of this work on real-world evidence. And Mr. Giovannis will be making some brief closing remarks at the end of this program. The amount of electronic health data is increasing, we know, exponentially. This includes the electronic health records in many of the doctors and hospitals today, along with the increasing use of digital issues as health tools such as wearables and other technologies. We believe that real-world data can and should be used to improve the evidence base and modernize the ways in which we evaluate drugs and biologics, both for regulatory approval and for payment, including this new value-based payment models that are out there. Today we want to have a discussion about the benefits and challenges of using real-world data and evidence for these purposes, and the progress. We want to know about the progress that the FDA has made in this area and some of the actions that might be needed to accelerate the use of this data going forth. This forum, along with the input from many individuals over the last several months, will be reflected in a final report that we will issue shortly. So without further ado, as I said, it's a rare moment to have the current commissioner and three former commissioners all together at once. Commissioner Gottlieb will make a few remarks and has agreed to take questions from the audience. That will be followed by Janet moderating a discussion with the 3 former FDA administrators. Dr. Gottlieb needs no real introduction to this audience, so I will be brief. You have his bio. He was sworn in as the 23rd Commissioner of Food and Drug in May of 2017. He is a physician, medical policy expert, and public health advocate who previously served as the FDA as its Deputy Commissioner for Medical and Science Affairs and at HHS as Senior Advisor to the CMS Administrator. Dr. Gottlieb was previously a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a clinical assistant professor and hospital physician at the New York University School of Medicine in Manhattan. So without further ado, let us all welcome Dr. Gottlieb.
Thanks for having me here today. With the current commissioner in the room and the 3 former commissioners, Secret Service put Peggy Hamburg in an undisclosed location, so she couldn't be with us. Bad joke. It's not bad. It was a good try. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. It was a good day to be at the agency today. I spent my morning welcoming back our employees from the prolonged shutdown, many people who had been on furlough. And the people I talked to were really pleased to be back. This has been a hard episode for the agency, but as I think was said at the outset, the agency really held fast to its mission. And I think that was exemplified probably best by the activities across the agency, frankly, but if not by our field force and what they were able to do through this episode. We continued to do high-risk inspections of food facilities, medical device, and medical product facilities all through the shutdown. These were individuals who were working not only without pay, but incurring expenses on their personal government travel credit cards. We offloaded the costs of the lodging and the airfare that they were incurring as they traveled about the country doing these inspections, but we couldn't offload the per diem costs that they were incurring. So you had the specter of our inspectors continuing to do that inspectional work while they incurred costs with no real sense of when they would be repaid. So I think it just shows the exceptional dedication of the people at FDA and the work that the agency was able to do under challenging circumstances. I have some prepared remarks today because we're making a couple of announcements and we're going to post it up on the website, so I hope you'll bear with me. But I couldn't be more delighted to talk about the topic of today's discussion. Digital technologies, from our perspective, are one of the most promising tools we have for making healthcare more efficient and more patient-focused. New streams of real-world data gathered from electronic health records, lab tests, wearable devices, insurance claims, and even social media can provide important evidence on product safety and effectiveness in settings or populations that may be very different than the information gleaned from registration trials that are used for FDA approval of medical products. This isn't an indictment of randomized controlled clinical trials, far from it. It's a recognition that new approaches and new technologies can help expand the sources of evidence that we use to make more reliable treatment decisions. And it's a recognition that this evidence base can continue to build and improve throughout the therapeutic life cycle of an FDA-approved drug or medical device. In many cases, these tools also help make prospective trials more efficient and more reflective of how care is delivered in the real world. To take one example, pragmatic and hybrid clinical trials, including decentralized trials that are conducted at the point of care and that incorporate real-world evidence, can help clinical trials become more agile and efficient by reducing administrative burdens on sponsors and those conducting trials, and allow patients to receive treatments from community providers without compromising the quality of the trial or the integrity of the data that's being collected. RWE also has the potential to make America's healthcare system more competitive and efficient, as validated outcome measures based on real-world data are incorporated into value-based payment contracts. This is all happening right now across the healthcare industry. Providers and other stakeholders are already exploring effective ways to leverage electronic tools to gather vast amounts of health-related data from EHRs and other sources. And they're working on ways to use advanced analytics, including machine learning algorithms, to transform data into evidence that can be used to help guide clinical decision-making or inform innovators during the development of medical products. At FDA, we're committed to advancing ways that data leveraged from these streams, typically called real-world data, is transformed into evidence using transparent data standards that can give all stakeholders confidence into its provenance, and so that more of this data can be used to generate the evidence that the agency needs to improve the regulatory decision-making of our work. advancing RWD into regulatory quality real-world evidence is a key strategic priority for the FDA. In December, we released our 2019 strategic framework that outlines how we'll continue to advance these opportunities in the coming years, and how we'll use these new tools and opportunities to advance our review of product effectiveness and post-market safety. RWD and RWE are already being used extensively for post-market monitoring of the safety of products during their use in real-world settings. And to give just a few examples, our use of RWD and RWE derived from our Sentinel system eliminated the need for post-marketing studies on 9 potential safety issues involving 5 products, making our post-market evaluation of safety issues timelier and more effective. And we're just getting started incorporating these methods and tools into more routine elements of our review process. Traditional post-market studies typically require years to design and complete and cost millions of dollars. By using RWD and RWE, we may be able to provide patients and providers with important answers much sooner, identifying a broader range of safety signals more quickly and following up on them much more efficiently and effectively. The use of Sentinel and similar tools will increasingly let us shift some studies and data collection to the point of care, making the collection of data and development of actionable evidence more efficient. Our work applying RWE to effectiveness decisions is also advancing. In the oncology setting, for example, we currently have new drug applications under review where RWD or RWE are helping to inform our ongoing evaluation as one component of the total complement of information on effectiveness that we're evaluating. This is especially relevant when it comes to the evaluation of treatments for uncommon conditions such as rare tumor types. To take advantage of these opportunities, the identification, evaluation, and addressing of post-market safety issues has now become much more multidisciplinary within the agency. In addition to these endeavors, it increasingly involves closer collaborations and interactions between the FDA and global regulatory authorities and other innovators. In appropriate cases, we've also accepted RWE to support the evaluation of efficacy in product approvals using data from registries, natural history studies, and chart reviews to establish a comparison arm in single-arm trials in oncology and rare diseases. RWE, captured in this way throughout the totality of a product's post-approval life cycle, has been a significant aid in informing both the development of new products and changes to existing products. We're also exploring ways to better harness patient-reported information, and this includes our recently announced My Studies mobile application. There are additional advances that we're exploring under our new framework, and these involve the use of RWE and RWD to help support revisions to labeling about drug and biologic product effectiveness or safety. And this includes adding or modifying an indication, such as a change in dose or dose regimen or route of administration, adding a new population into a drug's label, or adding comparative effectiveness or safety information into product labeling. The framework involves the establishment of demonstration projects and stakeholder engagement, as well as the use of internal processes to bring senior leadership input into the evaluation of RWE and promote shared learning consistency in applying this new framework that we announced. We're also working to develop new guidance documents to assist sponsors interested in developing and using RWE in their development processes. Our Framework for Real-World Evidence program will apply a consistent strategy for harnessing these tools across our drug and biologic review programs. The framework's aimed at leveraging information gathered from patients and the medical community to inform and shape FDA's decisions across our drug and biologic development efforts. And this framework will serve as a cornerstone of our efforts to advance the use of these tools. And in 2019, we'll advance other new initiatives to better leverage RWD and RWE in all of our programs. Our framework also calls on us to develop new guidance on considerations for designing clinical trials that include pragmatic design elements as one tool for generating evidence of effectiveness for regulatory decisions. And we'll also evaluate the potential role of observational studies and contributing to the body of evidence for demonstrating drug and biologic product efficacy. The goal is to develop a path for ensuring that RWE solutions play a more integral role in drug development and regulatory life cycle at FDA. And today I'm announcing 4 additional activities that will help FDA and stakeholders advance these opportunities for the benefit of all patients. First, to support seamless integration of digital technologies in clinical trials. This year we plan to convene a stakeholder meeting to help develop a framework on how digital systems can be used to enhance the efficient oversight of clinical trials. These technologies present important opportunities to streamline drug trials and improve data site integrity by remotely monitoring data trends, accrual of data, and the integrity of the data over the course of a trial. To take just one example, traditional on-site monitoring of each clinical trial site to evaluate study conduct and perform 100% source data verification, as many of you know, is highly resource intensive. It accounts for up to a third of the total clinical trial costs. But traditional on-site monitoring doesn't guarantee data quality. Findings must still be evaluated to determine their true impact and whether additional actions are needed. By working collaboratively with the clinical trial community and patient groups, we can develop scientific and technical standards for incorporating new technologies into clinical trials and make them more agile and accessible to patients and regulators. This includes through the use of early quality checks to ensure that we have reliable data we need to confidently assess patient safety and product efficacy. To take one example, remote and risk-based monitoring can provide better regulatory oversight in certain situations. These approaches may lower development costs and enable more trial sites to answer important scientific and clinical questions as a way to improve patient care. Second, we also see great potential in using digital technologies to bring clinical trials to the patient rather than always requiring the patient to travel to the investigator. And this is a high priority of the FDA in the coming year. We believe that more accessible clinical trials can facilitate participation by more diverse patient populations with diverse community settings, where patient care is delivered and process generate information that's more representative of real-world settings and can help providers and patients make more informed treatment decisions. This approach, called decentralized clinical trials, can help move prospective data collection into the real world, including randomization, outside of brick-and-mortar boundaries of traditional clinical research facilities, tapping into not only EHRs, but additional digital health tools like wearable devices. To support the development and adoption of decentralized trials, the FDA established a formal working group on decentralized trials, and we're working towards writing a guidance document to outline this approach. We'll have much more to say about this in the next couple of months. Third, we're also exploring how reviewers can have more insight into how labeling changes inform provider prescribing decisions and patient outcomes. The FDA's Information Exchange and Data Transformation, or INFORMED, is using RWD to examine the impact of a recent FDA labeling change on 2 approved products, from weight-based dosing to flat dosing of immune checkpoint inhibitors. This project is focused on how community practices are adopting the flat dosing regimen after the labeling change and factors that may affect adoption of these new labeling recommendations. As the volume and velocity and variety of real-world data reaching the agency increases, we have an opportunity to use new software-based learning algorithms like natural language processing or deep learning to help develop regulatory science tools like surrogate endpoints or digital biomarkers that can be used to guide more efficient development programs. Machine learning and artificial intelligence skills are highly sought after, and it can be difficult for FDA to compete with lucrative pay packages available in the private sector. But the FDA has many staff with deep quantitative expertise in these endeavors, and we want to help develop and retain the agency's human capital in these fields. So among other steps, in 2019, INFORM is going to be working with the medical product centers to develop an FDA curriculum on machine learning and artificial intelligence in partnership with certain academic stakeholders and other partners. The aim of this program is to improve the ability of FDA reviewers and managers to evaluate products that incorporate advanced algorithms and facilitate the FDA's capacity to develop novel regulatory science tools harnessing these new approaches. The agency will also pilot a competitive fellowship program under INFORMED in artificial intelligence and machine learning that allow postdoctoral fellows from leading academic centers to join FDA for 2-year fellowships to develop high-impact AI-based regulatory science tools by working closely with mentors from the agency's medical product centers. These are just a few of the ongoing efforts at the FDA related to RWE and RWD. The FDA's Oncology Center for Excellence is also working with Friends of Cancer Research, leadership's here today, and the National Cancer Institute and other stakeholders to harmonize reference standards for assessing tumor mutational burden, or TMB, as determined by multiple proprietary assays to help identify cancer patients who are more likely to respond to cancer immunotherapy. Harmonizing the measurement of tumor mutational burden across commercial assays used in routine oncology care can help reduce treatment variability and improve the utility of TMB as a potential biomarker for enriching clinical trials for testing immunotherapies. Our Oncology Center for Excellence is also working on a project exploring whether it's possible to use real-world endpoints like time to treatment discontinuation, or TTD, as a potential real-world endpoint for pragmatic randomized clinical trials for FDA-approved therapies in the post-market setting. Through Project Switch, OCE, our Oncology Center for Excellence, is investigating whether well-matched contemporaneous synthetic control arms based on prior clinical trials can be used to make inferences regarding the effect of a new drug, or whether a synthetic control could be used to compare data to active control arms in ongoing randomized controlled trials in rare tumor types where the standard for care remains stagnant and prognosis is especially poor. By engaging with multiple stakeholders through collaborative forums and working closely with our agency partners at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and the National Institutes of Health, the agency can help promote more transparent standards for curating data, interoperability, and RWE generation that can help ensure that every American patient, no matter where they live or what their insurance coverage is, benefits from the full range of these potential technologies to make our healthcare system safer and smarter and more patient-focused. Thank you for your time today. I think I have time for questions. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks.
Hi, Scott. A fantastic presentation, and really, really happy that you're doing this. We worked very hard on getting this through Congress through 21st Century Cures, and there were a lot of critics. People that said we're denigrating the data, and this is a problem. I think what you're doing is absolutely wonderful. However, the extraordinary complexity of understanding this data and understanding the metrics and understanding the quality of the data is not so easy. So can you talk a little bit more about how you're able to work with the academic institutions or people to really come in? Because at the highest levels at FDA, I think people buy into this, they understand the importance, understand what this provides for patients, but it's highly complex. So how will this work? Because it's hard to get the talent you need at the agency, because they can go to venture capital and be made, tons of money. So how will this work with the academic centers and the training to make sure the rank and file understand this?
Well, I think it's like a lot of other things where we've incorporated new tools into the development process. You look at what we did with modeling and simulation, where 15 years ago, we sort of pioneered a group, modeling and simulation group, when Mark McClellan was there, that started with 2 people, Larry Lesko and one other individual. Now we have a modeling and simulation group that's probably about 40 people, and 95% of applications that come into the agency have some form of modeling and simulation as a component of how the drugs are assessed in the development process. I think the same, I'm seeing the same thing with the use of these tools, where we're sort of developing centers for excellence around the use of these tools. You saw we are creating a new Office of Regulatory Science within the Office of New Drugs. That's going to be a hub, if you will, for the development of scientific frameworks for the adoption of these kinds of approaches in clinical development, the development of guidance, the development of standards, the development of SOPs, of good review management practices, guidance, internal guidance to FDA reviewers. I think, like a lot of other things, you're going to see some early adoption within certain review divisions of these approaches, and then it's going to become more democratized over time as we develop, this sort of scientific framework for how this can get incorporated into clinical trials. In the same way, if you look back at the early days of the use of modeling and simulation, originally it was used primarily for dose finding, and now it's used much more widely as a tool for assessing safety and effectiveness in clinical trials. Hope that answers your question.
Hey Scott, how are you? I've been involved in trying to get FDA and other groups to use real-world evidence for quite some time, and a couple questions. One is, I'm on a couple different FDA advisory committees. I was on MDAC a couple of weeks ago, and I was super excited to see the use of Sentinel data and additional analysis the FDA provided, but I was wondering when you think the Sentinel data will also include electronic health record data, because the claims data is very limited. And then secondly, as somebody who lives with a lot of medical devices that are constantly generating data, that would be really helpful to improve regulatory decision making, and as somebody who understands the data in some respects faster than researchers or physicians, because I see it in context 24/7. And I've seen this happening in other patient populations as well, where we get it faster. How are you going to involve those of us who live with disease and conditions in the process of evaluating and creating the new regulatory science using real-world evidence?
On the first question, so Sentinel is a wonderful resource for the agency. I think that it was developed at a time when we didn't have access to robust data from EHRs, and so we were dependent upon claims data. I think it has a lot of utility in the drug setting. Ultimately, we want to move towards a system where we can consolidate EHR data and do more real-time surveillance using richer data from EHRs. I think that the conversion towards the use of EHR data might happen, frankly, more quickly on the medical device side of our house, in part because the Sentinel tool on the medical device side of our house isn't as applicable, because claims data in the context of medical devices isn't as useful, because if a claim says you had a hip transplant, it doesn't tell you what specific product you might have had used in the setting of that surgery, especially in a world where UDIs aren't routinely included in claims forms. And so there's a real compelling public health prerogative to try to make more widespread use of EHRs, and you see us doing that with Nest, for example. And so I think that we're pushing ahead on the medical device in the medical device context to try to use the EHR data. In the drug context, we're focused on it as well, but Sentinel's still a valuable tool in the drug setting, and still a tool that we've invested a lot of money in. There's a request in the 2019, the President's 2019 budget, substantial request for resources to help build out some of these data systems that you're talking about using EHRs. Hopefully, and many of you probably saw the conference bill that was put out publicly, and you'll see some of those resources are reflected in the conference bill. Hopefully, if we get a budget passed in the next 3 weeks, agency will be receiving some additional resources to try to build out these kinds of tools, and I'm hopeful that that'll happen. But that was, we fought hard to put that in the budget, and work with Congress to provide them technical assistance as that was incorporated into both the House and the Senate mark, as well as the conference bill. As far as the process, part of what we do by developing guidance and doing things through a notice and comment is to provide the opportunity for public input. And so there has been, and there will continue to be a lot of public engagement with providers, with patients, with other interested stakeholders in this process. I think the way to get back to Ellen's question, the way to formalize these kinds of approaches as a matter of regulatory policy is to do it through things like guidance development and regulation where we have to, and that is inherently an open and public process.
That came over online. We've got more than 200 viewers. Can I borrow a mic? This one's from Lucia Savage. She's the Chief Privacy Officer at Omada Health. It's a digital health company. In recent years, the FDA has approved a number of devices that send digital signals which help manage chronic conditions like continuous glucose monitors for diabetes and monitors on asthma inhalers. Our measure and incentive system currently relies on in-clinic data, this is related to our report too, like lab sticks for glucose, for example. How close are we to the time when these digital signals, coupled with data science, can be used to measure health outcomes for MIPS? She says MIPS, but also maybe for clinical trials. For example, a glucometer showing that blood sugar was under control in lieu of in-clinic information. What is slowing this from happening?
From my perspective, we're seeing this already. We have constructs on both the drug side of our house as well as the medical device side of our house where you can get approval for a tool as a regulatory tool for purposes of measuring an outcome in a clinical trial. And we've seen products. I mean, some of the early approvals have been around measurement tools, but we see there are products that are coming to us that have these capabilities where sponsors are both seeking to use them in clinical trials as well as seeking to validate them and get regulatory approval for them as tools for the use in clinical development. So I think that the time is right now.
Other questions for Dr. Gottlieb? Questions?
I would just add, sorry, it's Anna McCollister again. I would just add that there are a bunch of us in the patient community who would also be really interested in proposing new regulatory tools or evaluative tools based on our experience that it's not easy to do as a patient. The system is set up in a way that is designed for sponsors, which, you know, those of us who don't have a regulatory team to advise on the process and to staff up, it's challenging. So I would encourage you to think through ways to make that easier.
We specifically put out a guidance to try to sort of democratize that effort. Is that, Kathleen, was that out already, or is it coming out? I can't remember. All right. Well, we're developing guidance. I think we issued it, but I lose track. But that's specifically geared towards the patient community to try to, you know, and academic developers really to try to take the, you know, the ability to develop these kinds of tools and get them validated by the FDA out of the hands solely of sponsors and put it into the hands of smaller investigators. And so I think that was actually issued. If not, it's going to be issued shortly. Yeah. It was issued? Yeah, it was issued.
Final questions? Okay, so please join me in thanking Dr. Gottlieb. Thank you for joining us at the Bipartisan Policy Center. All right, I'm going to ask our, thank you. I'm going to ask our panel to join us up here. We're going to have a discussion about real-world evidence as they're making their way up. I'll do some introductions. We're so pleased to have all three of them here. You have no idea how difficult. They're busy men, and you know, it's just, and to have the four is just been terrific. On my left, delighted that we've got Dr. Rob Califf here, who's the Vice Chancellor for Health Data Science and Director of Duke Forge, the Center for Actionable Health Data Science at Duke Health. He's also a professor of cardiology at Duke University School of Medicine, a chair of the board of the People-Centered Research Foundation, something that we're highlighting in the report. We're getting ready to release, and an advisor for Verily Life Sciences. It's a member of the Alphabet family of companies formed by Google. He also served under the Obama administration as the commissioner of the FDA in 2016 and 2017. On his left, I'm delighted that Mark McClellan's back with us again here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And in particular, have really, we've benefited a lot from working with your team on our work on real-world evidence. So thank you. He's the director, and Robert Margolis, professor of business, medicine, and health policy at the Margolis Center for Health Policy, also at Duke University, a physician economist. And he held two roles, and I think about, you know, our topics today. Not only was he commissioner of the FDA under George W. Bush, but he was also the former administrator of CMS. And so as we start to think about measuring outcomes and how that can support both efforts, his guidance has been fantastic. And then on his left, Dr. Andy von Eschenbach, another welcome back to the BPC, and we're hoping Dr. Califf will come again. Dr. von Eschenbach serves as a senior advisor to us here at BPC, president of Samaritan Health Initiatives, and he was also a former commissioner of the FDA from 2006 to 2009 for a long time, and then also served as the director of the National Cancer Institute for 4 years. So that's our panel. We're going to get right into it. This is going to be more of a conversation, but you know, we talked about the amount of data that's available and would love to get your all's thinking. Data's increasing at an exponential rate. Both Dr. Gottlieb and Bill talked about that. And this, you know, represents a significant opportunity for evidence generation. And I know you all have been working on this issue for a long time. Can you share with us, you know, what's possible? You know, what could, now that we've got all of this, what could the future look like?
You have to decide where to start.
Dr. Califf?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, in my current job out in Silicon Valley, what was talked about today is really a very small part of the overall data that affects health. We have to remember that we've known for a century that social determinants are much more important than biological determinants for most people. in terms of health outcomes. And you know, this means things that you do every day affect your health. Do you exercise? Do you smoke? Et cetera. These measurements are actually readily available now in everyday life because you all carry cell phones and wear watches, and you know, that data is being dealt with. What we need are a set of constructs and ethical principles that put the data to good use. It's like a tremendously potent capability that we now have. And the question is, you know, will we use it to err towards better health and good outcomes, or potentially could go the opposite way if it's not done well. So, you know, the future to me looks like a continuous stream of information, hopefully in a situation where the individual and the family have control of access and use of that data. But most people would readily see that sharing the information is going to be the best way to help yourself, because the way that you learn about how to have better health is by knowing the experiences of other people like you, whether you're talking about response to chemotherapy or the best way to keep from, as I like to say in the South, stopping at Bojangles and eating a biscuit, you know, when you really shouldn't, which is a great temptation for me where when I'm living in North Carolina. So it's a new world. We've got to map out these strategies. I just want to say I'm really excited, you know, having been there for 21st Century Cures, and I'll add the user fee agreements, which are really important here. The way the FDA is rolling out the guidances and sort of implementing, I'm really excited about. I think it's going much better than I expected even. This is a time, though, for people to weigh in. As occurred in the dialogue, we really need people to weigh in on the guidances, because one thing I did learn at FDA, pretty much if the FDA says something, the industry is going to do it. And so we'd like to get those guidances right.
They're coming out fast and furious. I mean, the execution rate. Other thoughts about what's possible?
Well, Jan, first of all, I want to thank you for putting this together. It's great working with BPC on this and so many other issues, and great to see the progress that's happening at FDA. I think Rob's vision for what the future ought to look like, which is a lot of data from a wide variety of sources, including many that a lot of people in the healthcare industry aren't really thinking about as important sources of health relevant information. That is the right vision. I still think we're still a long way from getting there, despite all of the FDA guidances with such kind of fundamental challenges as turning data into evidence, which gets to issues like what do we know? How confident can we be in the underlying data sources themselves? For some of the more sophisticated algorithms around AI and machine learning, Scott touched on in his remarks the need for better understanding how those algorithms get to the recommendations they make. How does that get incorporated in a regulatory process that typically puts a big premium on transparency and replicability, not black boxes or sophisticated algorithms that may not be readily apparent. And I know, I'm surprised Rob didn't bring it up, but I know he will, which is that just because you see an association between two different things, the data shows that, I don't know if it's eating at Bojangles, I won't go there, but some kind of behavior, say, or a treatment that people get and an outcome doesn't mean one caused the other. I think a lot of issues related to diet and lifestyle and medications, we know that, but many of the questions that we have today about does one treatment work better than another in this particular population of patients, what are their impacts on relative costs of care and so forth, or are there other factors like patient characteristics that may be hard to measure and other things that may influence that relationship. So finding a way to build in either randomization within this real-world context, much more than we have in the past, or finding a way to make sure that the methods that we're applying to the real-world data are giving us a confident understanding of those relationships. That's really important too. And then finally, on the payment side, I'd love to see people at that point where they're comfortable in sharing data with their providers, with their insurers. Maybe there's a different role for drug companies, if they're really being paid for outcomes, not just for selling more pills, but we're definitely not there yet. And that degree of trust with the public, the payment models that can support that, I think still have a ways to go. So great vision, great potential, but we're going to need to keep building on today's announcement and the upcoming report.
Thank you.
Yeah, well,
Andy.
first of all, I want to add, you're really courageous, because last time we all got together, we were very disruptive, so hopefully that'll be the case here.
Was this at the Aspen Institute?
Yes.
Or, okay.
So we're taking the FDA independent. I actually want to build on what they've been saying, and you asked the question, what's possible? Mm-hmm. People won't die because planes don't crash. And I'll tell you what the storyline behind that is. I was watching, because my wife faithfully watches MSNBC, I was watching Brian Williams every night during the shutdown show a picture of all the planes that were flying across the United States late at night. And it was a stunning picture in terms of just how many there were. And it got me to reflect on something that I had learned from GE. GE has a system in which their jet engines have an incredible number of sensors that are in those engines, and they're sensing and monitoring those engines in real time. And so they know in real time if there's anything going wrong in those engines. Now, not all the sensors do it in real time. Many do, but others then, when the plane lands, immediately get downloaded. And so before that plane takes off again, they know if there's something has to be done with that engine. And so planes don't crash. I think what we have is the opportunity with the kinds of tools that are now becoming available, be they sensors in humans, but be they the opportunity to access the data that's coming. In both real time and in retrospectively, we're going to be able to prevent problems. We're going to be able to see ahead just like they can. And not only retrospectively correct what's going, but prospectively be able to create what needs to be created to save lives. And you know, Scott's alluded to a lot of the practical things that are going on with regard to monitoring safety and also beginning to move towards prediction of efficacy. That's going to save lives. And that's going to save a lot of lives that we're currently, unfortunately, not saving. So I think that's what's possible.
Dr. Califf, you talked about with your vision. I'd love to go back. I think that what you've laid out is something that maybe a lot of us haven't thought about, actually. It's big. And you talked about the need for ethical principles. Can you say more? How do we, you know, HHS has an RFI out, you know, on privacy. We think Congress is going to start, there is discussion. Frank Pallone, Representative Chairman Pallone has talked about privacy. A lot of folks on both sides of the aisle are talking about it. And when I raised this issue of real-world data and real-world evidence and the opportunities, it's very exciting. But there may be, you know, how do we get our arms around the ethical, any thoughts about how to do this from a process standpoint?
Yes, I do have thoughts, and I love to pick on people. So let me just pick on universities a little bit. Mm-hmm. I was glad to go back to a university that I love. It has a great basketball team, by the way. But this is too important to leave to the tech companies. I work for a tech company too, and it's full of really smart people. But the fact is, the technology that Andy described is in all of our homes already, and we're wearing that technology. The sensors are there, and tremendous good can come of it. So who is it in society that has all the different kinds of people with all the different backgrounds and ways of thinking to come together to come up with a set of constructs that can guide us forward? I would not want to leave it to politicians. I'll pick on them a little bit. I think, they by nature have to be reactive to immediate things that happen. And what I learned at FDA, among many lessons, the law works best when it's guided by evidence and some really good background, not just by the lobbyists, but actually by people who have deep content knowledge in the field. So you got schools of religion, ethics, political science, medicine, nursing. They all exist at universities, and I really think we need them to wake up and pay more attention to this. Maybe later I'll go into the fake medical news thing, which is a huge issue right now. I also want to put in a plug for randomization, since Mark mentioned it. They're sort of having information, there's having knowledge. They're not the same thing. And I call it God's gift of randomization, because we see over and over mistakes made by people who assume causality because of an association. And it's a big danger in the machine learning field because it's so automated. You get answers quickly. And I learned that in the business of Silicon Valley, for example, randomization is routine. Well, if it's important enough for business, why are we letting doctors and patients guess about life and death decisions? And then finally, you look at, I've often used my mom as background for this. She's had a miraculous set of treatments with multiple myeloma, but she is now in hospice, at age 91. And I just look at the decisions that we're making every day. There must be 200,000 people just like her that if we had all the information compiled, you would know which decisions were right and which were wrong. But because of our current views of privacy and the way we deal with it, it keeps that information from being useful for my mom or whomever is in that situation. So I'm not advocating it just all be thrown out there. We need a set of principles to guide it, not exactly like the ones we have now.
A set of principles, and Mark, I was thinking about what you said. We've got all this data, but we need to turn it into evidence. And again, I looked at who's here today. There aren't a lot of people that are entrenched in the real world data or real world evidence. We mostly have a health policy crowd. I mean, could you, it seems like a big undertaking. How do we do it? How do we move from data to generation of evidence where, we can help folks like your mother? How does that work?
Well, I think it start somewhere. I mean, there are plenty of opportunities where we can learn more. Care for people who have advanced and serious illnesses is maybe one good example, but there are lots of others. Rob and I are working together on another project with the American Heart Association around the very disturbing trends and increases in population mortality related to cardiovascular disease, despite increasing spending on health care. And it very much has to do with some of the social drivers of health outcomes that Rob was describing earlier. So there's the potential to learn. The pieces are there. I think technically, it's not that hard with today's technology. It's just finding a regulatory structure that people can support, and some of the steps that FDA is taking around guidances and the like will help with that. It's finding some new ways to implement these studies. This is an area where I think there's some room for additional NIH activity, kind of building out there, moving away from traditional clinical trial settings out into the community. But perhaps most important, I think, is building up trust with people, that their data are going to be used for the right purposes. And there actually are some people in this room who are working on data sharing, trust relationships, and giving people more control and therefore more confidence in how their data are being shared. And some of the federal policies around individual control, I think, are helping with that. So if we just link up those steps to some practical, bold challenges around developing evidence, I'm hopeful that we can make more progress. But I think it's really about putting people at the center of this and giving them confidence that if their data are going to be used in studies, it's going to be used for purposes that they understand, not necessarily for marketing or someone else making more money. I think there's a lot of evidence now that when people are engaged in their research, and Quarry and other groups are doing a lot to advance this, that you can get very strong public support and hopefully answer some of these important questions.
You know, I really want to build on that, and I know Andy will probably have a comment about this stuff, but if you just go back 10 years ago, we were fundamentally limited by computing and information dissemination. You know, the iPhone happened and a bunch of other stuff happened now. There really is no technical limitation to using all the data that's out there in the era of the cloud, and where even the poorest people in the world have cell phones now. They have tremendous capacity to get information. It's not the technology that limits us at this point. It's the culture that's limiting. And, you know, I have a few more things to say about American culture later, but we'll get to that.
I was just with, oh, I'm sorry. I was with Don Rucker last Thursday, and I didn't realize this, but the NHS put billions of dollars into this big health IT system, right? And they don't use it anymore. He says they're using open APIs to basically exchange information across a whole range of settings, including the ones you describe. And so I think this is closer. This is going to happen sooner. It's happening now. And it feels like this ethical principle discussion couldn't be more important. I wonder how Congress or administration or the private sector would do it. And I know I'm going down the privacy road.
I'm going to parse your question into two parts. You sort of asked, how do we get from data to evidence, which is one question, and then the other one was, what's the ethical principles underlying how that is going to be used? So they're really, I think, are two separate things. I see the how do you get from data to evidence very much the way a doctor takes care of a patient. You start with the acquisition of data, and we are overwhelmed now by the amount that we can acquire that's being dumped onto us. So I don't, as we've talked about, we don't have a problem now with acquiring data. What we do have a problem with is aggregating it into information, because the data is coming in different sizes, shapes, colors, and flavors and whatever, and we need data standards. We've talked a lot about that. But the real key then is getting from acquisition and aggregation to analysis, where you then know, where you can act, where you then truly are at evidence that directs a course of action for that individual. And I think that's where we still have a lot of challenges, is in that analytic part of the equation to manage that and deal with that data. The point you made otherwise, which is how do we do that in an ethical, appropriate kind of way, I think comes down to some of the apps. There's going to have to be a connection between a patient's or a person's contribution of that data and something they get in return. Now, we do that every day, all the time, with apps, and you always get that disclaimer that you have to go through and say, I agree, and we never read them. We just go through to the bottom and say, I agree, and now I've got Waze, and now I've got, you know, Google Maps and all that kind of stuff. Well, they're using that information in amazing ways that we've given them permission for because we're getting something in return. I think we need a value proposition for the public that really links why this data should be made available and accessible, why we should then be able to aggregate it, analyze it, and act upon it, because it's returning to them something of personal, real value. I don't think we've really made that case statement yet, and I don't know whether you guys think we have or not.
We certainly haven't carried today, because it's more, I mean, one of the things that I think I've learned, you know, it's sort of overwhelming to plant yourself in Silicon Valley right now with all the things going on. But I think one of the things I learned is it's just what you said, people get things back, but it's very immediate. With health, often the things that are most important have to do with deferred gratification and the application of executive function, like don't eat that Bojangles biscuit, go exercise instead. It's not fun in the minute. It doesn't feel good, but you have to overcome it. So there are many issues in making that connection for people, but I think we will get over that hump. But it's going to take a lot of people looking at it and thinking about it. So I'll just go on my little riff now about America, because I think this is not, in my view, this is not optional. And the thing that Mark and I worked on with the American Heart Association last week, it's really all the common chronic diseases. And right now, out of the 18 most economically developed countries in the world, the U.S. is number 18 in life expectancy. It's the only one where life expectancy is going down out of the 18 most economically developed countries, and the gap between the PAC and the U.S. is widening considerably. So it's not like we're static. We're actually in a negative direction in this country. It's very much driven by disparities. The difference, though, in what's happening with the disparities now, there still are very significant racial disparities, but the urban-rural concentration of wealth and education in particular areas. If you look at the rural United States, and the way I think about this, go to a state like North Carolina, look at the 6 cities that have universities. They're all experiencing an increase in life expectancy and better quality of life. If you go 3 counties away, you've got just the opposite. Even if you go to California, compare San Francisco and Lake County, California, 9-year difference in life expectancy. So, some of us would say, what's different between us and the other 17 countries? It's not technology. It's they believe that healthcare is a right, and they have a primary care system that works. But I still love the Churchill quote, Americans will always do the right thing after they've exhausted all other possibilities. So we will use a high-tech approach, but the inevitable result of having good information is this will be obvious. Just to finish taking shots at things, I'll take a shot at the NCI. And I tweeted about this. I thought the new clinical trials program is fantastic, but it stops short of the biggest thing that's needed right now, I think, which is financial toxicity in cancer is killing more people than almost any kind of cancer. People not being able to afford the treatment and therefore not getting it. So unless you start doing outcome-based studies to find out the real value and set a price at a price that people can afford, where it does great benefit, it should command a good price. Where it doesn't, it shouldn't. But we can't discriminate now because we don't have the data.
Aren't you leading up to the fact that this focus on real-world data leading to real-world evidence is the solution to the kind of problems you're talking about? I mean, we did something simple at FDA just now, putting calorie counts on menus. That's influencing people's decisions. Maybe not everyone, but it is having, once the data is available, then people can choose to act on it. Without the data, we don't have a basis for action.
Yeah, these diet and lifestyle and other behavioral issues mixed with high out-of-pockets for costs for healthcare are a really tough combination for a growing number of Americans. And there are steps. There are steps that could be taken, not only to, it's hard to change your behavior. It's hard to get the care that you need when you're paying so much out of pocket. But there are steps that can address that. There are lots of really good models for helping people in rural areas or helping people with limited means get access to the care they need. It's just not the kind of care that most people are getting in the U.S. healthcare system today. And we still don't have, and I know part of the report dealt with payment issues too, we still haven't made that much progress on getting at, I think, kind of the root issue underlying some of the points that Rob was making, which is that, look, we've got a healthcare system that's really good at taking care of people who can afford it when they get sick. We don't have a healthcare system that's good at identifying those who are at risk before they come in, going out and finding them and intervening early with effective approaches to head off the costly complications before they happen. And that's going to take some more fundamental changes in, I guess culture is part of it, but payment is part of that too. And that's
Can
good,
we talk
good part
about
of the
that?
report.
Yeah, can we
but
talk?
more needs to be done.
Let me just say I do. I mean, I want to note, I agree with Andy that what he said was the solution, but it seems odd to me that the FDA is leading the way on this issue when we need other people doing it. So I really commend Scott for following through.
But don't you think the FDA's probably the most uniquely well-positioned agency to take the lead on this because it's the honest broker. And it's always been the repository of data. I mean, I remember when I first arrived, they took me down to the basement where all the new drug applications were in that big warehouse. I mean, here was a repository. This agency had data about every drug that's ever been approved, and those that haven't. So it's an agency that has been a repository of data. It may need to be authorized to make more widespread use of that data in directing how things get done. I think it's been more reactive and maybe needs to be more proactive.
Yeah, so
why not FDA?
So let's be a little rambunctious here. We're former FDA commissioners, not currently under any administration. So I agree with you in one sense. We all came to love the FDA because of the scientific rigor that exists there and the honest broker function, which is tremendous. But the FDA deals with medical products. It doesn't deal with healthcare, and we need both. And we need to integrate multiple medical products across a person's illness. So, you know, we need the other components of the system to step up and play. I mean, I love that the FDA is taking the lead. I just am saying we need other components to step up.
It has the real, not to belabor this, but, you know, again, going back to where the agency has had challenges. Again, when I got there, and met with Bob Brackett, I said, this is the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. What are we doing beyond that food label on the cans of Campbell soup or something? So again, when you talk about chronic diseases and you want to move the agency's mission a little further, you could take that applied nutrition and really begin to look at the points you were making about Bojangles and everybody else. So I still would lobby for the agency playing the central role in federal leadership for establishing a healthier America.
Yeah, I just don't, I'm not used to ever being in last place. I never was in sports, and I think we need to wake up like we are in last place. We better do something about it.
Yeah. So can I use this as a segue? Sure. Tomorrow, Senate Finance Committee is having a hearing, bipartisan issue, affordability of medications, prescription medications. The White House is focused on this. Alex Azar, the secretary, folks on both sides of the aisle in Congress. When we've talked to plans, you know, there's a lot of, can you tell us in the room, you know, there seem to be a lot of value-based payment models that are emerging, where manufacturers are working with payers to sort of not just, you know, thinking of new ways to pay for medications, and they all require data. I wonder if one or more of you might sort of opine on what's happening, particularly for our audience, what the challenges are, and you know what, you know, is there opportunity for collaboration or cooperation between FDA and CMS?
Well, so I could start with a couple of comments. I'm sure Rob will want to be rambunctious at that point too. But first off, I do want to get to drug pricing. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But back to the core issues here of can we get to a healthcare system that's really about health? Drugs can certainly help with that, but a lot of the drugs that can make the biggest difference in some of the risk factors, these chronic disease risk factors, are no longer brand name. They're generic. They're just still not used necessarily reliably or easily, and I think that's because a lot of the people who would most benefit from these treatments are also worried about some more basic issues, like do I have a safe place to live tonight, and am I getting can I afford a reliable, good diet, and these other issues like medications and all get to be secondary. So I think this is going to take some payment changes and some redesign steps and further steps that move beyond just medications alone. That really are about supporting good community-based models of care for people who are just having a tough time now, especially in rural areas, especially with limited means, just having a tough time keeping up with just managing their basic risk factors and the stresses in their lives. The good news is there are a lot of healthcare and other community-based organizations out there that are doing good work in this area. Often they are enabled by data. A lot of these approaches would not be possible without the kinds of steps that have been made feasible by some of the wearable devices, remote monitoring, telemedicine, other types of steps. But again, not really in the healthcare sphere, more in the community organization, social supports, and the like. And biggest difference between the U.S. and other countries, partly, I guess, it's the way the healthcare system is designed, but biggest difference is other countries put relatively a lot more resources into addressing these social factors, education, neighborhoods, infrastructure than the U.S. does. And if we're spending a lot of money on healthcare, it just gets harder for state, local governments, the federal government to do that. So these are bigger issues than drugs. Now on drugs, there are a lot of these agreements starting out. My sense is that, and our center does a good deal of work on this too, is that many of them are kind of at early stages, just getting going. A lot of the payment reforms that have taken place more broadly in the healthcare system also started slowly, just in a little incremental steps away from fee-for-service. So a lot of the arrangements that are out there, they do have a step towards connecting payment for a drug to outcomes, or maybe to reducing costly complications and the like. But still, a lot of payments are fee-for-service based, and to get really away from that probably is going to take some further regulatory steps, like we have and the report and the BPC work deals with issues like so-called Stark and anti-kickback rules, where for very good reasons there are prohibitions on different providers or providers and manufacturers giving each other things of value. When you're in a fee-for-service payment system, people should rightly be concerned that that may not lead to spending on things that really improve their outcomes and reduce costs, but maybe just increase costs or increase profits. In models that really get away from that get away from paying based on volume to really supporting outcomes, supporting community interventions and targeting treatments, if the manufacturers as well as the providers are now primarily at risk for improving health, getting better outcomes or better indicators of outcomes, whatever we can best support with turning all this data into good methods and reliable evidence on improving outcomes, then I think we're in a different ballpark. But I think it's still early days in terms of moving away from the volume-based approaches to payments to ones that really are going to enable sort of different approaches to care. And we've seen that. You mentioned England spending a lot of money on it, on an IT system that ended up not being that great for really improving population health and going to apps and the like. Well, we've had our own history in the United States of spending a lot more money, government money, than England did, with the aim of getting to interoperable, reliable data that could support good outcomes. So it's not for lack of spending on health IT. It's, I think, more lack of alignment with really paying for and supporting the kind of community-based, population-focused approaches to addressing these really concerning challenges in outcome trends and cost trends, healthcare cost trends in this country that we need.
Let me riff for a minute on this, because I think Mark said a mouthful there, almost 100% of which I agree with. And I like the way he positioned the paradigm as it relates to medical products. We got a ton of highly effective medical products that are essentially generic now, and we're not using them very well. Particularly for people like me that work at a university or live in San Francisco or Boston or Washington. Things are great. Go to rural America and people are worried about having a meal to eat, and You know, what is it, 50% of Americans couldn't meet a $400 emergency if it came up. And so then we say, you know, come see your doctor and get all this straightened out. Actually, I think this is a place where high tech can make a big difference.
Yeah.
Because they all have cell phones, and when we change from you got to call and make an appointment to see a doctor to you can interact the way you interact in other things in your life, that'll change. But we do have a problem on the innovator side. Let me just say I'm totally in favor of the accelerations that have happened. I think they're good. But we have to recognize that now we have a gap because something is accelerated means by definition you do not have the evidence that you need to figure out what it's actually worth. And it's good if it looks really promising to make it available.
Okay.
But if you charge $500,000 for every new treatment, it's hardly a surprise that people in rural areas are by and large not getting access to those treatments. They can't afford to do it. So we've got to have a system that fills in that gap for the innovator products. Andy was right. I mean, what we describe is the theory, but the question is who's actually going to make it happen? And here, watch North Carolina. I can't tell you how excited I am. I never thought I'd see the day. But, you know, it just turned out that Mandy Cohen, who was Chief of Staff at CMS, is now the Secretary of HHS in North Carolina. And Patrick Conway, who was the Chief Medical Officer at CMS, is CEO of Blue Cross Blue Shield. Mandy has put the state on notice that North Carolina Medicaid will go to two-sided risk within a year. And Patrick has just beaten, I don't know how to say it nicely, he's beaten up the big academic medical centers, and we all marched together arm in arm to go to a planned movement to two-sided risk by 2021. Mark had a lot to do with developing the theory that filled that in. And so now you got a situation where for the majority of the payment in North Carolina, I love the way Mandy says it. She says she wants to buy health, not health care. And she got a great waiver from CMS that almost literally, if you wanted to provide housing and food instead of clinic visits, you could do that. That's a bit of an exaggeration.
Start doing that, but yeah.
Okay.
They say that. But just to add to that, it also Medicare is changing the way that it pays. So recently announced a new version of its so-called Accountable Care Organization program, which many of these North Carolina systems are participating in and have to move farther away from the old fee-for-service kinds of models. And for those of you who are interested in this, I can plug a Duke Margolis event very quickly. Right, next Friday we have a summit with Mandy, Patrick, a lot of the leaders, business groups, and others from around the state who very much, as Rob said, view this as a tremendous opportunity for change, but one that's going to be very hard, I think, to follow through on and succeed in just a few years. And these issues around finding better ways to use data to improve health and get it right the first time and reach out to people who need assistance rather than waiting for them to show up at a doctor visit. I mean, this is all going to be hard to do, but it's a challenge that the American healthcare system really needs to take on now, and these real-world data, real-world evidence can certainly help us support getting there.
I know almost 100% of people could agree that if I said, you know, we have this amazing problem of an epidemic of obesity in the United States, and the way we propose to treat that is we'll tell you to try to call your doctor's office, get an appointment, wait 3 months, sit in the waiting room for an hour, talk to your doctor for 15 minutes who's typing into a computer while you're trying to talk, and then you get some prescription and walk out the door. You'd say, who on earth would ever treat a problem like obesity that way? And so this is where the integration of the data and the information and modifying the payment system so that if you get results, you get paid more. That would be a good thing.
There are two things that I would add to what's been said and bring it back to the focus on the data. First of all, when you look at the way we deliver health care, it's episodic. You come in, you see me, I write your prescription, tell you to come back in 6 weeks or 3 months, let's see how you're doing. No manufacturing process could work like that, where the interventions are widely spaced. What works best is a continuous process of constantly monitoring and making changes. So when you think about what we could do with this new world of data, there was a great study that you guys would relate to as cardiologists that took patients who had myocardial infarctions. They sent half of them home with a wireless blood pressure cuff and a wireless scale, and the others they just sent home, and everybody was to come back in 3 months. But they had the wireless folks measuring their blood pressure and their weight every day, and it was transmitted. If they didn't get a transmission, they called them. Why, didn't you get on the scale? If they got the transmission, everything was fine, they left them alone. If they noticed weight went up, blood pressure was up, they called them, told them to increase their Lasix, whatever. Cut the readmissions post-MI by half in the monitored group as opposed to the non-monitored because their care was being continuously monitored and modulated. That's the promise of a lot of where we're going in this new world, is that patients' care can be continuous and continuously altered or changed and improved before there's a problem. Second piece is that the biggest problem in our system is waste. It's treatments that are inappropriate or ineffective or overly excessive. And so the goal is get the right treatment to the right patient for the right reason, and you're going to get the right outcome with the right cost. That's, again, the promise of what this real-world data to evidence can provide for us, is to be able to look at large populations and be able to determine what is actually occurring so that we know what the right treatment is for that right patient, and then be able to get that right outcome. So I again think that there are corollaries to this conversation of where are we going with these technologies? What can we do in the real world with moving from data to evidence? And what will that mean for the kind of problems that they've been describing are wrong with our healthcare system?
Can I build on that? And I know I've got 11 minutes before we go to an extended Q&A, but all three of you, and Scott has talked about using patient-generated information, and which sounds exciting, and it sounds like we need to go there. But when we talk to folks in the traditional regimes of evidence development, whether it's regulatory or even outcomes-based payment, we're not there yet. They say that there are all sorts of issues. We can't use patient-reported, patient-generated or patient-reported data. If you were Scott, or if you were Seema Verma, or, how do we, what are the steps from getting from here to there? Like marrying what's possible with what we have today. Any thoughts?
I'm not sure where you're trying to go with this, but I don't see we have a choice. I mean, the world is changing so rapidly and so dramatically with regard to the tools that we've been talking about. And so healthcare lives in an ecosystem. We've been woefully behind the curve when compared to commerce and banking and everybody else when it comes time to really being able to use data and the tools to manage that data. So we have to catch up. We don't have a choice anymore.
So the regulatory reviewers, like what do they do? Like how do we change?
Yeah, so I do feel like I should say a couple of things that are fairly specific because I've come to believe they're really important. When it comes to sensors, I live in sensor land when I'm in California. And the smartest engineers in the world, no question about it. The difference between a sensor in a controlled environment and a sensor in real life is profound. And to my knowledge, there's a reason the Apple Watch has a disclaimer on it, and there's a reason the Google Watch we just got cleared, it's not for medical decision making, it's for research, is that there's a lot of work to do to deal with the human factors, the artifact, the noise, what happens when you go swimming, all kind of things that happen that can lead to erroneous decisions that can be highly consequential. Those are not so relevant for a consumer device because no one's making medical decisions. You like to know your steps. That's fine. It doesn't have to be all that accurate as a consumer device. But if it's determining a medical decision, you're in a different ballgame. So there's actually very significant work to do there. For patient-reported outcomes as symptoms, I think I'm totally with Andy. But what we need now is an evidentiary chain that, for whatever reason, people say, we just measure it, it's okay. It's not quite that simple.
Okay.
If you take, like, when people have profound depression, they report their symptoms of other types very differently than when they don't. So we need to develop the knowledge by comparing A and B in terms of, and that's beginning to happen. There's a good framework the FDA's already put out. CTTI has a good framework for it. I think it's going to happen. We just need to speed it up.
Yeah, I think finding some good leading examples to do this. I would highlight the point about, look, if we really want to focus on getting medical products or the way we deliver care focused on what matters most to people, focusing on those patient-reported outcomes and asking people about what it is that they want to experience and whether or not they're getting it is a pretty important place to start. I get that there are going to be a lot of confounding factors, and that for many of these measures it's going to be messy. That said, a lot of these measures of patient-reported outcomes have been studied pretty extensively, have been pretty well validated, and it shouldn't be that big of a leap to incorporate them into wider use in FDA regulatory processes. And FDA has developed a number of guidances in different disease areas to support that. And same with the payment side and the care delivery side. So there are a lot of healthcare systems like Duke that are trying to begin to put patient-reported outcomes into their longitudinal tracking of patients. I'm thinking of Orthopedics in particular, where they found that tracking patient functional status before and after joint replacement procedures helped them take steps to improve the care processes and care experience for patients, modify post-surgical rehab and so forth in ways that improved outcomes and saved money. They've now taken that a step further, and by tracking patient-reported outcomes, talking to patients more beforehand, turns out that for a lot of patients there may be less costly approaches than surgery with good support for physical therapy, managing behavioral health issues and so forth, that if we had a good payment model to support it, really could be much more patient-centered. And there are health plans that are starting to do this as well. Blue Cross of Massachusetts has a program where they pay more to track and then maintain patient functional status if patients have osteoarthritis, with the goal of accomplishing that rather than just accomplishing more and better procedures. So this is starting to change, and I think we need to keep working on finding these concrete, real, important examples where we can accelerate progress.
I have a question for these two guys based on their comments. From the private sector and from the academic sector, as these best practices emerge, as these examples of where there's really been incremental but disruptive progress, how should that be identified and disseminated? Is it the marketplace that's going to do that because it's the best app and everybody's going to gravitate to it? Does government have to step in and say, this is the way it's going to be from here on because we've got proof of principle or proof of grounds? How are we going to organize this fermentation that's going on out there that's happening extremely rapidly so we identify where those winning transformational breakthroughs occur and then we disseminate it? How's it going to happen?
I think, I hope the magic formula will be a balance between, we're talking about technology now, so I'm biased towards big tech now. There are reasons to not be biased, but I think the race is on with Alphabet, Amazon, Microsoft, et cetera, and they by definition are broad disseminators. They're built to do that. But the regulatory check really needs to be there. And to me, the most beautiful guider of science in history is the FDA guidance. And I think we all need to pay attention to how to get the FDA guidance into optimal state so that it reflects the field. Because if the FDA says, here's something that worked, follow this pathway, you know very well that other people will do that. There you go. Okay.
So I think FDA has an important role to play. Just would emphasize that getting these technologies developed is really important because they are a means to an end.
Yes.
They're cool. The data is great. The technological capacities to use the data potentially is great, but let's not lose sight of what this is really about, and that's improving the health outcomes of people all over this country, particularly those that are not doing so well under current policies. And that's where I think the payment reform discussion that we've had is very important, supported by, I would love to see, sort of on a wish list, FDA has gotten a tremendous amount of additional resources over the last decade to develop better ways of bringing drugs to market while still having confidence that they're safe and effective. That took a lot of regulatory science. It took a lot of investment by both the public and private sectors in developing these new models. Would love to see something like that on the care delivery side. So better, maybe more resources for CMS and more resources to support private payers, businesses, and individuals in this country to be able to get their questions answered about more effective treatments. And
Quarry's up for reauthorization, right?
They are, yes. I think we're going to have them over for an event.
And I think we need to get everybody over this hurdle about comparative effectiveness and looking at costs. So just my view of it.
Are we going to be able to do that this year?
Well, if you ask, I've said it over and over, what's missing? I mean, Mark said it, there's a gap in our ability to do the things that would give us the information. If you look at decisions that people and doctors are making every day, most of them are not informed by high quality evidence because the product studies currently being done only take you so far, and then you don't, is one thing better than another? How do you combine them? How do you combine behavioral and other services with medical products? We don't have a system to deliver that information.
And CMS is trying really hard to give people better choices about their health care. And so if you do have, if you need a joint replacement, or if you think you do, but if you've got degenerative joint disease that's bothering you, how could you find a health care system, not just a doctor visit, but a health care system that's going to give you give better outcomes for someone like you at a lower overall cost? And similarly for so many other health care conditions, we don't really have a whole lot of infrastructure devoted to supporting that. So I'm not to say, it's not, I just want to emphasize it's not just about Quarry and the comparative effectiveness studies. It's about the capacity to support the kinds of decisions that people really care about and that their doctors and caregivers really care about to get the most out of what would hopefully be a better health care system.
We're running out of time. I want to note one thing that you brought up that we didn't follow up on, and I was very excited to hear Scott's description of the efforts to continue to develop the workforce at FDA.
Yes.
And, one thing that surprised me when I got into the job was how many people thought that they're like these pointy-headed people that sit behind desks at the FDA who somehow can make judgments about medical products and should be kept completely away from understanding how things actually work in the real world. And on the other hand, the referee function that we all came to love, the unbiased referee function, demands that you not have, inappropriate influence on the reviewers at the point of decision. So we've got to really all work on how do we keep the FDA vital, up to date. You cannot do high quality machine learning and data science without people that are very up to date, because it's a field that's changing rapidly.
We could do a plug for the fellowship program?
Yeah, something like that.
The fellowship program, the FDA fellowship program.
It's
more
critical.
Resources to the FDA. I wish we could go back and talk about comparative effectiveness and what's the next step. We have to go to questions, and we've got a good amount of time. Maybe let's start here where our gentleman, thank you. You could state who you're with and your question.
Lou Gagliano, yes. Coalition to Transform Advanced Care. and we deal with end-of-life care and how to look for best practices that drive longitudinal changes using best practices. And I want to go back to the North Carolina project that you're going to do, and I think the two things you should consider is looking at how do you really take the ACO model and add to it behavioral changes, because the combination of those two will lead to longitudinal changes in care models. Second thing is I would encourage you to look at end-of-life care, because we know the resources it spends, and we think that a payer-driven issue on both of those sides, a little bit on the rough edges concept, would work really well in both the ACO model and as well as end-of-life care. Thank you.
Okay. Then Ellen, welcome. We're glad you're here.
Yes, I'm happy to be here. Rob, I happen to like biscuits. Just want to put that on the record, okay? I just happen to like them. Okay, so you may be in some trouble with me on that. So I'm going to ask you something that all of you know something about, and that's about the Quarry, PCORnet, Sentinel, IMEDs, probably combined amounts of money over $1 billion. I don't think anybody would design those systems the way they are now exactly, but we put a lot of money into methodology. What can we do to integrate electronic health records and claims data, and how can we make these systems, because we're still spending a lot of money and they exist and a lot of money has gone into methodology. What can we do to make these better? I mean, we've tried to do pilots. I mean, it's in a system that exists.
Well, first of all, I just want to totally, I love to argue with Ellen. People may know that.
He always loses, though.
$1 billion is a pittance for this. I mean, you're talking about all of health and healthcare, this segment, $1 billion. The NCI alone is getting how many? $6 billion for one disease a year. So this is a pittance. It's not a large amount of money for a country of 320 million people. Having said that, you know, the cycle of ingesting electronic health records and claims data, it's getting faster and faster. PCORnet's up to once a quarter now with about 1/3 of America's health systems. The biggest lesion in the system actually right now, I've been spending a lot of time on this, is actually our clinicians are so under stress right now that they're not participating in prospective research because they're under tremendous pressure to generate dollars for their health systems using the RVU model. So I have great hope that another benefit of a change in the payment model would be allowing clinicians to get back to the reason they went into medicine, part of which would be learning.
You didn't answer my question.
What?
I mean, we've got PCORnet, we have Sentinel, we have IMEDs. You're all involved in it. You all know it. What can you do? Isn't that something? It may not be enough money, but it's a system that exists with a lot of data from a lot of people.
Is there a new paradigm? Do we build on? This was going to be my question if I had time, so thank you.
I mean, I know you've been thinking a lot about this too, so I'll save Andy for last on this one. But I mean, look, if you think about where we were, say, 10 years ago versus now with respect to Sentinel and all of these systems, I mean, Sentinel didn't even exist before legislation in 2007, and it's come from there to being a pilot that FDA tried out in a few places to being what's now an integral part of its systems, as Commissioner Gottlieb said earlier, for learning about and understanding adverse event relationships, and even doing some studies of effectiveness, like around flu vaccine dosing and things like that. So it's come a really long way. The idea of extending it through IMEDS, Reagan-Udall Foundation project, for those of you who aren't following as closely as Ellen, so that other organizations can use this same, nationwide infrastructure to answer questions at a lower cost than they would have otherwise. We've got some starter examples of that. Scott mentioned a number of cases where FDA has not had to go to so-called phase 4 studies and all the costs associated with that, because there is this infrastructure in place. I think a good place to start for next steps on building this out further is FDA's recent strategic framework for the next 5 years of Sentinel, which does talk about some concrete ideas for integrating clinical data, medical, electronic medical records and the like, data from patients. It's not yet well specified. It's not, it's clear that the traditional Sentinel infrastructure isn't probably enough given, where we're headed in terms of, cloud-based and truly distributed data systems that can interact hopefully more quickly than in the past. But I think there's a very strong foundation to build on there, and combine that with continued pressure and paying for what really works to improve outcomes, not just paying for more stuff. I think it's a pretty good combination for the next few years.
Yeah, I want to let Andy speak last, but I want to directly just say data is a commodity now. I mean, the idea that we don't have data is just not true. Data is absolutely a commodity. The problem we have is linking the data to the clinicians and the patients, and that's what I was trying to say. The data will get better, and the data standards will make it even better yet, but you talk to any company in the United States, you can buy data for almost nothing now that gives you all the information pretty much that you need. But what we need to understand health and healthcare is prospective interventional studies to sort out what works and what doesn't. Andy may disagree with that.
You've asked a really critical question and a complex one, and I'll just try to be brief. I think it gets back to a little bit of culture, and we need to drive to integrated interoperability. So I think of it a lot like a cancer center. We're never going to get rid of surgeons and radiation therapists and medical oncologists. Those verticals are always going to be there, just like these entities are always going to be there. But if you can drive the horizontal integrated interoperability, allow them to maintain their identity, but drive and force the fact that it's got to come together around a common focus, breast cancer clinic, whatever. And I think FDA can be that prime attractor. I think FDA can help with that integrated interoperability without diminishing any other entity's principal focus. And it's okay to have that principal focus. We've talked a lot about that with regard to data sharing between CMS and FDA. They should be working from the exact same data, even though one's approving a drug and the other one's deciding on a reimbursement strategy. That's fine, but work from the same thing.
We have a gentleman back here and then a gentleman back here. I think and someone here. So maybe start here and work our way.
David Rhines, I know the health system and the American College of Surgeons. I'm in the weeds. I'm the guy who is suffering from all this non-interoperability that you talk about. You mentioned the FAA, and I'm a little tired of always surgeons being told about the FAA, because every pilot in the world has to speak English. And yet Cerner doesn't talk to Epic, and our $500 million, not the $500 million, doesn't talk, and I know, but doesn't talk to Hopkins, and Supreme Court justices and senators have to get their own records. So if we're going to go and talk about real-world evidence, somehow, hopefully the FDA and CMS can say, no more. You guys have to be able to talk to each other, and all your data is going to go into the cloud or somewhere so that we can make statements about diabetes or congestive failure and combine those data. Right now, when we supply studies, we each have to do our own thing. Why can't CMS, FDA say enough's enough? You guys have spent billions and billions of dollars. The federal government has given it to us. Why don't we make interoperability an absolute?
So the timing is great because we've got a proposed rule dropping soon. There's a lot of interoperability policy going on right now. What's the wish list for our friend Don Rucker and Seema Verma and Secretary Azar? What's the government's role?
Well, he and I sat in a room many years ago deciding this exact same thing. If government's paying, you do it our way, period. As opposed to a counter argument which said, we don't have the final answer yet. Let Marketplace go off and figure it out.
Open
and the best
APIs for
practice will
everyone?
emerge.
I don't
so
know.
are we there at a point now where we have learned enough and know enough that we can superimpose
Well, I think
the
there's
standard?
a lot that can be done through Open API, and I know that BPC report is going to have some specific recommendations about how to build on FHIR and some of the other techniques that, well, I think that helps, but I mean, to the underlying issue here about lack of data sharing, I think, is more than just technical standards alone. A lot of industries have figured out standards, airline industry and others, when they had like a really strong and clear motivation to do it. So I think you may have been alluding to this, Janet, but one of the other regulations that I think is also in the queue is related to so-called information blocking, another provision of 21st Century Cures legislation, which the administration has been very clear that they don't want to tolerate. They've tried to make changes in the so-called meaningful use rules to make them more about actually share data. So the standards, those regulations, I think they help. But at the core of all of this is still that a lot of these health systems, including many of the big ones, and then Duke to some extent now too, although that's supposedly going to change, are still have business models that's based on more volume themselves. It's less about figuring out the best, lowest cost way to get the patient what they need, and more about, well, how do we get more people in our systems? How do we, quote unquote, monetize our data? And I think it's going to take not only the continued work on standards and use cases around practical, good applications to overcome these barriers, and maybe some regulatory penalties. Those are going to help, but I think it's really gets back to more fundamentally, what is our healthcare delivery about, and can we really reward? Back to Rob's point earlier, I think physicians should be paid more when they're doing what it takes to share really important data about patients for studies or for improvements in patient care, and that's just not what we're supporting financially today, despite a lot of efforts.
I mean, I'd say even though it's a terribly complicated problem, I really don't. The major problems now are not technical. If you talk to Cerner and Epic, what they'll say is they designed the product the way they did because the health systems they're selling to told them to do it that way, because it's been in the interest of health systems to block data sharing. Let me just give one analogy that's my guiding light now. Think of yourself 11 years ago, and you wanted to drive somewhere in your car. Right, you would start driving, and if you felt lost, you'd pull over the side of the road, get out a map, unfold it, try to figure out where you are. And then the iPhone came out, a year after that, and somebody figured out, you can put the iPhone in the car, and you can just talk to your phone. But why does that work? It works because there's a map of every road in the United States that's kept completely up to date 24/7. It's the only reason that works. The technical issue of naming the roads, of integrating the information coming in real time and converting that information into a human voice that you talk to, that's done. So
have we done that for healthcare?
That's what some of us are working on.
Oh my.
Now, you'll argue, well, it's 100 dimensions great, roads are simple compared to human health. But, it just should be the case that you know where you are on the map, and you can get directions. There's no reason that you can't talk to your phone and get a lot of it, other than, in other words, it's not a technical issue now. It's really working through it.
And if you don't map everything in healthcare to begin with, that's okay to start somewhere. So like you can actually get the data you really need on your patient from another location timely, and so that we could actually make some practical progress on some of the big public health challenges and healthcare cost challenges that we've talked about today.
Imagine if I told you today, you're going to have to, pull off to the side of the road and pull out your map and unfold it. You'd say that is totally ridiculous. But we're telling people to try to figure out who their doctor should be and to figure out what number to call, and it just goes on and on. And the doctors are, I think your point's well taken. you know, we call it moral injury instead of burnout now because the doctors are really frustrated with it.
I know we have a lot of folks who want to ask questions. Oh, hello.
Yeah, hi. Matthew Ong with the Cancer Letter. This would be a really weedy question that would be great for Ellen, but she's not on the panel, unfortunately. Like Scott was saying, you know, the FDA is focusing on creating endpoints that are equivalent to OS or PFS, progression-free survival, treatment, time to treatment discontinuation. And the focus here is on regulatory grade, high-quality data to support decision-making. So what is the difference here between, you know, our traditional endpoints and what we're trying to go for in terms of equivalency, and what are the challenges in the difference in trying to make that happen, or do we need a completely new framework, which I understand that Francis is working on with FDA?
Maybe do a short, so we can get
That's
to
just
a
a
lot of
really
questions.
complicated question. I mean, I will say I'm very excited that Amy Abernathy is coming to the FDA because she's an expert in this. She and I worked together many years back in the good old days, so I have every confidence that she'll help guide through this. I don't think the general framework is actually different. It's just that the source of the data is different, and we have to work through how that works.
Do you mind if I go to the next one? Just I want to get in as many as possible.
Hello, my name is Carl Pulzer. I'm a longtime health policy analyst who's lived to survive to be on Medicare coverage. And I also do a lot of work on economic inclusion and disparities. And I'm just wondering, isn't there a huge policy, you know, being a cranky health policy person, there's a huge policy issue that's got to be decided before people are going to open themselves up to giving out their health care information. That's medical underwriting and affordable coverage guaranteed to all Americans. Because right now, if my watch can capture, you know, my medications and my psych meds or my blood pressure and all these things and send it to the university that has, you know, deal with the insurance company researchers, and then all of a sudden it goes over to the actuarial table, and within 20 seconds, you know, I try to get insurance. Oh, it was $10,000. Now it's going to be $12,000, or maybe you can't get it. Underwriting's not dead yet. It still exists in certain market segments, certainly in long-term care insurance.
That's a great question.
So I think. I just wondered, you know, don't we have to kind of, to get little guys to open up, to share their information, to guarantee that they're not going to, it's not going to be used against them?
Look at what Patrick Conway is doing in North Carolina is a good mark.
I think it helps. I mean, we obviously we're not there yet in terms of affordable, competitive health insurance that works well for everybody regardless of their health status, but there certainly has been important progress. You're in Medicare now with the way the Medicare Advantage program works. There's no, you know, there's no discrimination there, and I think further steps that look at what's worked in making some innovative approaches to care and coverage available in Medicare probably has lessons for other places too. And I think North Carolina is definitely concerned about these issues and in appropriate ways of regulating competitive markets and encouraging steps like what Blue Cross is doing there, and a number of the other private insurers are doing to try to make you know, better innovative care models available to people, especially for people who have like serious chronic illnesses. That's where the best opportunities are for improving health and lowering costs.
Thank you. We have a couple questions here.
Bob Griss with the Institute of Social Medicine and Community Health. I was intrigued by the discussion earlier, Mark's comments about public health strategies, food and housing being sometimes more critical to health outcomes than the medical procedures. And yet FDA is one of the regulatory agencies in healthcare, but also deals with other things too, like food. And I'm wondering to what extent the requirements for proving effectiveness are precluding the looking at certain kinds of nutritional information besides labeling. Labeling is something you're proud of and took a hell of a long time, but at least we have that now. But to what extent are the requirements for proving effectiveness and safety preventing medical providers from using alternative treatments? I think this is an area that doesn't get a lot of attention, and I would like to see how FDA can influence this in a more constructive way.
Who's want it? Mark?
You were, Mark. Mark's really, I don't want to speak for him, but this is one of the things he indoctrinated me about, which was he was really passionate about the idea of food labeling in a way that we could direct people to making wise choices about the things that they were consuming and being able to then make that a prescription for health. And so I picked up on it, but it was your leadership that really put a lot into that.
Thank you. I know that's an issue, too, that FDA's continued to try to work with around claims that relate to health and diet or foods. It is a challenging one, right? Because you've got to balance on the one hand, you want to encourage more behavior in this direction. On the other hand, you do want the evidence to be sound. And maybe this, too, is an area where better data and methods to use it to turn it into, we like to say, sort of fit-for-purpose data and evidence for regulatory uses could help.
It's a very political issue, and the law prohibits the FDA actually from requiring those kind of studies, except for drugs and devices, basically. So I actually see it the total opposite of the way you said it, that right now the market is flooded with all kinds of bogus stuff that people are advertising and selling in lieu of things that are proven to be safe and effective, because there is no requirement, for example, for dietary supplements, that they show that they're safe and effective.
I have to go here. You know, we're running out of time. We have one question. My boss, Bill, is going to make a comment. We're going to be really quick, and then we're going to turn it over to Ted. Really quick question.
Hi, Anna McAllister. One of the things I've been arguing for years to Jeff Shuren and Rob and probably Mark is that currently FDA is no longer living up to its regulatory mandate or its statutory mandate to monitor the safety and do true surveillance on medical devices, because technology has evolved to the point at which it's now easy to do open APIs and to have access to regular streams of data from many of these devices. So I think that it would be within the FDA's discretion to be able to use their decision-making ability to now require and mandate for all regulated medical devices that have digital data streams to mandate open APIs for those devices, and that the failure to do so means the FDA is not actually using all of its power to do true surveillance and monitoring of the safety, accuracy, stability of medical devices. I was wondering what your thoughts are on this question, because it would help solve a number of issues, but patients and researchers and regulators really need to solve.
How many hours do you have? I mean, I didn't completely follow everything that you said, but for sure, the issue of regulating devices in an era where digital components of devices can be iterated upon by the second is a huge issue, and there is no way to regulate I can think of other than very significant transparency. That's got to be balanced with all the cybersecurity and other issues that are involved. So I think it's a very hot area of policy where, we do need to advance. I agree with that. I'm not sure that I know the
I do think expectations around device safety and device surveillance are going to continue to increase, and the digital capabilities that you mentioned are part of that. FDA's initiatives around Nest and kind of more active full life cycle evidence generation about medical devices are at least moving in that direction.
In the interest of time, I just was going to not ask my question about value-based pricing of some of the new gene therapy type drugs and FDA's role there. But as a part wearing my management hat here, I just want to close out by pointing out that Bojangles is not a sponsor of BPC. and is not likely to be after today. Let me turn it over to Ted.
I was just saying, when Duke makes a three-pointer, the scoreboard actually lights up with its bow time is what comes on the scoreboard. Yeah.
Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel. We could have gone for another couple of hours. And with that, Ted Giovannis is going to make closing remarks.
Yeah, and I'll be brief given the time. But one of the things that our foundation does is we support important research and projects focusing on innovation, and we go in the space where a lot of folks don't go. And we operate both in the policy space, which is this, but we also operate in the healthcare space, and in that space we're pretty heavily invested in metastatic breast cancer. We had to pick something, and that's where we initially started to go. And so now that we have so much knowledge about that, we can't. It's not appropriate to go back and change something else. We were involved in the first RWE project, yes. And so this is sort of a continuation of that. So as I said, we fund innovative research, and we focus on data analysis, and certainly the events that relate to that to try to, I guess, dramatize or draw attention to the research subjects that we get into. But we want to foster dialogue and collaboration, and we also want to be a broker of new ideas. This is important given this panel of thinking, because that's sort of what we need in healthcare. We need a new way of thinking, and part of that means that we have to check some of our egos, and it'll involve a lot of, and that's maybe what you see. I don't know, but maybe that's what Mark's referring to in North Carolina. We have these differing aspects, and where you have health plans and universities and academic medical centers, and yeah, we do have big egos in academic medical centers and the researchers, and in our physicians. So it's a new way of thinking, and hopefully collaborations tell us that and get us excited about working with other people to have different ideas. With all that, we're interested in incorporating real-world evidence. That's part of this process. It informs new and different ways of thinking about things, and we're all, in the end, we're all looking for the aha, meaning that's a better way to do it. And maybe there's a bunch of different ahas, and it works differently in different spaces. So with that, we look forward to the report, which will be coming out shortly. And I thank Rob and Mark and Andy for working on this with us, and we're looking forward to the new policies that come out from the work that we're doing and recommending. And I thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. So stay tuned for our report, which will reflect today's discussion as well as our work. Thank you. Thank you, Ted.